There are so many events in history that nobody talks about, yet they had a massive impact. It's the 5th of August, and today I want to tell you about an event that almost stopped the United Kingdom before it started. The Gowrie Conspiracy. Hiya, I'm Bruce Fummey. If you're interested in the people, places and events in Scottish history, then at the bottom left hand side there's a button that you can click to subscribe at any time during this video. In the meantime, let me tell you a story. Today, I'm in the village of Falkland in Fife, loved by Outlander fans because it was used as the setting for Inverness in that TV series. Behind me is the fountain that Jamie stood at looking up at Claire's window, and there's Mrs. Baird's honeymoon bed and breakfast. But today, I've got a more important story to tell you. The Ruthven family were a powerful and important family in 16th century Scottish politics. The family prestige went back to a previous Ruthven who'd helped William Wallace capture Perth from an English garrison, and he was later rewarded by Robert the Bruce. Now they had hereditary rights to the title of Provost of Perth. That's Mayor if you're English. Now at the time Perth was called St John's Town. And I want to tell you about 3 generations of Ruthvens that brought their prestige to an end. Patrick, 3rd Lord Ruthven, was near the end himself. He was terminally ill in 1566 when he led a group of nobles into Mary Queen of Scots' chamber to murder her courtier and close confidant, David Rizzio. When Rizzio hid behind Mary's skirts, Patrick Ruthven pointed his pistol at Mary's pregnant belly and threatened to kill the future James VI in the womb. Is it true that Mary predicted that her unborn child would wreak vengeance on the Ruthven family? I don't know. I do know that Patrick Ruthven's son William was only a bit part player in the murder of Rizzio, but he played a leading role in the life of Mary and her son James later. A stone's throw from Falkland, Lochleven Castle was Mary's prison when the Protestant lords of the congregation captured her at Carberry Hill, and William Ruthven was her custodian. It was here under his supervision that Mary was forced to abdicate in favour of her son, the new James VI. This was the scene of a palace coup, and William Ruthven was at the heart of it. Now you might think that William Ruthven's days as a royal jailer were over, but no. When the young James VI was 14, he raised William Ruthven to be the Earl of Gowrie. Was Ruthven grateful? No. Exactly a year to the day later, William Ruthven, Earl of Gowrie, abducted and imprisoned the 15-year-old king here at Ruthven Castle and put himself at the head of government. In what became known as the Raid of Ruthven, James was an effective hostage for 10 months before he freed himself from the Earl of Gowrie's grasp. When James reached adulthood, William Ruthven was beheaded for treason. Now, the village beyond the castle is still called Ruthvenfield. The castle itself is now called Hunting Tower. That is because of a day in the life of James and the 3rd generation of Ruthvens. Which brings us to our story. Now, I'm going to summarise the story as James himself told it, because for reasons that will become clear, that's the only version we have. Now, James came here to Falkland for a day's hunt. That was a regular activity for the Stuarts, but this day would take a turn that was totally unexpected and have consequences right down to the present day. The 22-year-old Earl of Gowrie at the time was John Ruthven, but he had a younger brother, Alexander. Sandy, if you're Scottish. On the morning of the hunt, young Sandy arrives here at Falkland and he says to the king, "I'd like you to come over to Perth to Gowrie House." "Why is that?" says James. "Well," says Sandy, "last night I captured a man in a field." "A man in a field?" says James. "Aye, a man in a field with a pot of gold." "A pot of gold, you say?" Now, at the time, the English were still trying to meddle in Scottish politics. Queen Elizabeth had paid John's dad, William Ruthven, money when he kidnapped James and taken over the government. The Spanish were also intriguing in Scottish politics at the time. Why would somebody be going around Scotland with pots of gold? Are they trying to raise money for an army? Are they trying to bribe spies? Can James get his hands on the money? More importantly, What's he doing in a field? I arrested him. I arrested him last night, and I think you should come to my brother's house in St Johnstown, Perth, and interrogate him, says Aunt Sandy. Oh, so your brother knows about this? No, my brother doesn't know anything about it. But he's in your brother's house? Yeah. Who is he? Oh, I don't know. Well, what does he look like? Oh, I don't know. But you said that you'd arrested him. Yeah. But he was wearing like a hooded cloak, so I didn't see his face. He was wearing a hoodie. That does sound suspicious, right enough. Well, it was more of like a hooded cowl than a hoodie, but yeah. So you arrested him, but you didn't take the hood off? No. And he's in your brother's house? That's right. But your brother, he doesn't know about this? That's right. Let me get this straight. Last night, you're out wandering the Perthshire countryside, you come across a random hooded guy in a field with a pot of gold, looking like a character on a Led Zeppelin album cover. You arrest him, you take him back to Gowrie House, you smuggle him inside without your brother or his staff knowing. You don't tell your brother, the Earl of Gowrie incidentally, and the Provost of St Johnstown. You've now left the gold-laden Grim Reaper in Gowrie House with the gold to come here to Falkland and tell me to go and interrogate him. Aye, that's right. Sod off, mate, I'm going hunting.
Now that might have been the end of things, but James must have been intrigued enough by Sandy's story, because he cut short his day's hunting and headed for Perth, St Johnstown. His entourage would have approached Perth through the parkland to the south that we call the Inch. As he approached, would it have crossed his mind that his ancestor James I was murdered in this town? As the Provost John Ruthven Earl of Gowrie welcomed him, did it enter his mind that James had executed his father, the first Earl of Gowrie? Did they consider the first Earl of Gowrie's part in the fall of James's mother? Did either man stop to think that the grandfather of James's host had threatened James's life even before he breathed? Do you forget things like that? Gowrie House was the best house in St Johnstown. It was demolished in 1805, but I've outlined where it stood next to magnificent gardens by the River Tay. It was officially the property of the Crown. It had been a temporary prison for James the young hostage during the Raid of Ruthven. It was the townhouse of his current host, John Ruthven, the Provost and Earl of Gowrie at the time, and it would have been the prime spot on the river for the most prestigious house in St Johnstown. Gowrie House has been replaced now by the courthouse and a busy car park, so I've come across the river to Rodney Gardens. It's a much better place to tell the story. So King James arrives at Gowrie House, but it seems like John Ruthven, the Earl of Gowrie, wasn't expecting him. Not only did he have no dinner or welcome prepared, he himself had already eaten earlier in the day. It was as if the invitation had never been given. There was certainly no food fit for a king. Now, people start running around in panic. I've heard tell that there was a wedding in Perth that day, so the Provost sends round to requisition the wedding feast to feed the king. Can you imagine being a bride? Oh, it's yourself. Come and join us.
The king is fed with grouse, hen, a shoulder of mutton and some strawberries. The bride and groom? I don't know. They say that music's the food of love, so maybe they had a sing-song. Hey. After his meal, he says to Sandy Ruthven, "What about this mysterious hooded stranger?" "Oh, aye," says Sandy, and leads him upstairs to the turret room. Now, while Sandy and the king have disappeared upstairs, elder brother John takes the king's courtiers out to the gardens to admire the orchard. And as they're admiring the orchard, somebody says, "Where's the king?" Somebody else says, "Oh, he's headed off back to Edinburgh." What? He'll never survive through Fife himself. James was a notoriously feeble and wimpy guy. John Ruthven goes off looking for his horse. The next thing, James is screaming out the upper floor window, "Murder! Treason! Help!" His courtiers run up the stairs to rescue the king. When they get there, they slit the throat of Sandy Ruthven. Now, by this time, the horse-searching John Ruthven downstairs realises something's up. He runs up the stairs to see what's going on. A sword fight ensues on the landing, and John Ruthven's killed as well. Well, clearly, this whole thing has caused a commotion in St Johnstown, which was incidentally much smaller than the current Perth, remember. But word has got out. The king's come to town, caused a commotion, stolen a wedding feast, and murdered the provost and his brother. A mob gathers and surrounds the building. Now, somebody in the mob arranges for gunpowder to be brought. The house and the lower floors are packed with gunpowder to blow up James VI and his courtiers in retaliation. A wedding cake's gone missing and somebody's going to pay. Now, just as the blue touch paper's being lit, one of the king's courtiers takes command of the situation. He manages to calm the mob, and the king is spirited out of the house and back to Edinburgh. The next day, James ordered that his full account of these events should be announced from the pulpit of every church. Now, we don't have time for the full story that James recounted. If you're really interested, it's in this book called The Blood of Kings. I'll leave a link below. Suffice to say that the tale of a feeble king overpowering and disarming a sturdy young man who's threatened to kill him in revenge for his father's execution, an armoured man in the turret room who stood by and said nothing, managed to get down the stairs past the arriving king's courtiers without being noticed and then disappeared never to be found, and an invisible disappearing hooded man with a pot of gold was so ludicrous and filled with holes, many church ministers refused to read James's account. In any event, the two dead Ruthven brothers were pickled in brandy and taken to Edinburgh to stand trial for their treason. Now, when they had nothing to say in their defence, there was only James's story, and they were found guilty. Here's the thing. If they died without trial, then their titles and estates would have passed to their heirs. But as convicted traitors, their assets passed to the king. Oh, did I forget to mention that James had been in debt to the Ruthvens? Well, no more debt and property to be divided amongst his cronies. That's why Ruthven Castle is now called Huntingtower Castle. It passed to the hands of the Murrays who supported James. Was James's story true? Was he punishing the sons for the sins of the father and grandfather? Was it a cynical scam to relieve himself of debt and acquire the Ruthven lands? If so, why didn't he come up with something better than the ludicrous story that he concocted? For whatever the reasons the day started and however it ended, there was one point during the Gowrie Conspiracy of the 5th of August 1600 when James was trapped in a building with explosives primed and ready to blow him and his courtiers sky high. Nowadays, every year on the 5th of November, we set off fireworks to commemorate James's deliverance from the gunpowder plot that never got anywhere near that close. Why is it that we know about one, yet most folk have never heard of the other? Could it be that 3 years after the Gowrie plot, James became King of England, and the gunpowder plot of 1605 was against the English king? Now, here's the point of this video. If James had died across the water there on the 5th of August 1600, who would have been the English king on the 5th of November 1605? James was chosen from the list of possible candidates because he was an adult male, he had Tudor blood, was Protestant and had heirs. If any of these four didn't apply, do you think the job would have gone to somebody else? If James had died in 1600, then 3 years later when Elizabeth of England died, would they have asked his 9-year-old son Henry to be King of England? I doubt it. Without James, what differences might there have been in the world? With no union of the crowns, would there really have been a United Kingdom? Without James, there's no 1609 Statutes of Iona to suppress the Gaelic language and Celtic culture in Scotland. Neither would there have been the plantation of Protestants in the north of Ireland for the same ends. How different our islands would have been. It's not just our islands. Without the plantation of lowland Scots in Ireland, there are no Scotch-Irish travelling from the north of Ireland to the Americas. the settling of the Appalachian Mountains, bluegrass music, right? John Witherspoon, Princeton University, and all these things. Without James, my American cousins, there would be no Jamestown. I'm just saying that this is a story that people should know on both sides of the Atlantic. And they will, if you share it. Hamindok is going to be a lam ally. Cheer and Rasta.